Well, 1 month before my ordination, I got a phone call. It was the creator of a pretty big worship event that was happening in New York and in partnership with an Episcopal church here in the city. Would I dance as part of the beautifully curated worship experience? Well, I love to move. Dance or any type of movement is my spiritual language. So my first impulse was to say yes, absolutely. However, with life, children, and now a whole new calling in ministry, I just haven't had the same kind of time to maintain what I'd consider to be a mandatory schedule of training. Over the years, I've developed a faithful yoga practice, so I'm pretty flexible still, and years of ballet training have poured in me a certain wisdom about my body as it relates to space, so I remember what it feels like to do an arabesque, right? And I understand what it means to hold or command space with the body. But dance demands something else. And that's stamina, cardio fitness. And that's just not something you can have if you don't work on it. So when she called, I didn't know how I was going to make this happen. I really wanted to do it. I didn't know if I could ready myself to dance for a roughly 3-minute solo. And so the questions: how do I keep myself ready for what has been and apparently still is part of my ministry? How do I stay ready so that I don't have to get ready? This is the basic point of today's gospel reading, the lesson for the bridesmaids who don't bring extra oil. But a contemporary reading of what is written as a kind of picture story presents challenges. It requires us to consider rather than gloss over all those details. A nuanced reading sees past these 13 verses, reads between the lines, considers what comes before and after the parable, remembers, holds this reading in tension with what Jesus already said about how we should live, and his open invitation to all of us. We have questions for the so-called wise who refuse to share, who in crisis are decidedly ungenerous. What of the command to love our neighbors? What of the lack of grace for the so-called foolish? It's hard to hear such an unloving response. The unrealistic demand placed on those who find themselves, for whatever reason, without. To read such a painful story of inclusion and exclusion, a story that seems to ignore the economy of Christ and the promise of enough for all. What do we do with the call to sleep? The bridesmaids get drowsy. All of them respond to the call and need for sleep. We can't simply be talking about an unreasonable call to vigilance. I've got a lot to say, as you can see, about this story of an invisible bride and a bridegroom who separates rather than unifies, questions for the so-called wise bridesmaids, and maybe a suggestion for the so-called foolish. Ladies, maybe you need a new community. But I digress. We only have so much time. So for now, I'll search for the meat among these bones. It seems what was required wasn't something you could buy in the moment. The eruption of Jesus, the immediacy of his presence demanded something more, something you'd been working on all along. You either had it, this light, when he asked for it, or you didn't. Surely there's something more for us to know or learn. What to do with this text, I'm not sure. I'm looking for a middle way. The text does offer what I'll call a general insistence that we, each of us, do the necessary soul work to stay in the game, to stay encouraged, to resist any numbness that can come from waiting, to keep our individual hope, light, alive. What does that look like? I propose that rather than an unreasonable, and I'll add unsustainable alertness, the times in which we live require a contemplative vigilance and attentiveness, a rhythm and way of life that keeps us prepared when we need to be, rather than running on empty. Written after Jesus' ascension, this text spoke to the disciples and their descendants who worried over Jesus' return, the promise of his second coming. As believers who sit on the other side of this original story of waiting, who recall the faith of our grandparents and our parents, and now wrestle with our own, who still wait, we know that what must be cultivated is centeredness, awareness, discernment. With clarity and thoughtfulness, we make the choice to bring the extra oil, to do what is necessary for our individual sustenance. The Chinese-American activist and philosopher Grace Lee Boggs suggests that these are the times to do the spiritual work of growing our souls. And I agree. It's not about a checklist of imagined perfection, but consistent practices that help us stay ready, prepared for whatever comes next. Now, I'm like you, I'm sure. I want to believe for a world where, when we have extra, we can and do share. I've long taught my children to bring an extra treat when they have them, reminding them how good it is to share from one's abundance, or to carry that extra $5 bill just in case. Jesus teaches about this kind of solidarity among believers, that our individual preparedness contributes to the needs of the collective. That's what we're taught. That in the kingdom, we'd insist our sisters stay rather than run away. But our reading today tells it differently, imagining a different time with different things at stake. It tells us to carry these things for ourselves, that something on the inside of each of us must be built up. And these qualities, won't be something we can readily share. It points to a kind of personal spiritual heft that must be cultivated, and that work is individual. This is a private sense of accountability, and it rests within each of us. We have to hear that spiritual heft can't be bought at a convenience store. Perhaps on the way, something about the journey itself will be a teaching moment for those who find themselves in this situation, but the text just doesn't readily offer this possibility. What we get is a reminder of the importance of the consistent cultivation of spiritual practices, rhythms of faithful work and rest as we live into our role as conduits of hope, keepers of the light. At the end of times, we need to be ready, spiritually developed, prepared to bear responsibility for our own spiritual journeys. As we come to the close of the church here, we can also hear this text as it speaks about time, both kairos and chronos. At the inbreaking, the eruption of Jesus at his second coming, the text encourages us to simply be prepared, to be and continually become more conscious, more responsible, more aware. As for Chronos time, as it is felt in our bodies, we hear a story of thoughtful diligence, of times of attentiveness and rest, times of careful and persistent effort, and times of quiet and stillness. In concert with faithful work, we discern the importance of those healthy rhythms. We work, absolutely we do. We carry the extra oil when we need to, and we rest we sleep, as required, of course. With time, we take the long view, thinking ahead and making decisions based on the information we have, and always with a foot planted firmly in the moment. What might be necessary in the here and now? What might help us live into the dream of tomorrow, another day? It's a balancing act, and this balance is important. We don't just bang away at our jobs with relentless fervor. We don't expect perfection or try with all our might to do everything right. We do, however, make choices that emerge from times of prayerful discernment, choices that emerge from this kind of faithful attentiveness. We listen to the times, and we listen to the needs of our humanity. We're always negotiating between what we know and experience and what we cannot know or see. A life of contemplative practice and vigilance helps with this. So what of the end times? When will we know? What should we do? Is it already happening? How do we prepare? What do we do while waiting? The text says, we won't know. Between the now and not yet, the what will come, we can hear this reading and use it as an opportunity to grow into our readiness. We can live into the promise of that coming, the imminence of Jesus, with hope and faith. Remembering our why, we do the best we can to keep the fire burning. Remembering the why, we rest. We do as we can. The times then as now tell us to stay ready. Hear it now as the call to contemplative attentiveness and vigilance, the work of spiritual growth. I danced into my priesthood on Thursday, September 21st, under purple lights at St. Bart's, and I used every day leading up to it to ready myself for that task. It was hard on my body in a way that it did not have to be. The fuel of even a weekly cardio session could keep me ready for opportunities like this. Time at the altar of a ballet bar, the pliés and tendus, the port de bras, are the regular practices of awareness that could keep me alert. These basic requirements are our simple and wise compliance. It is our remembered why, and no one can do it for us. This contemplative vigilance is the practical piece, the discipline and habits that keep us ready for the unexpected. Hear this, we are all invited, absolutely, but we can do something to make our individual roads a little easier. A practice, contemplative vigilance, tells us to bring that oil, to keep that fire burning, to take the nap when you need it, to tend to your spiritual life. If we want to be ready, we have to stay ready. Amen.